Welcome to our video where we will discuss fraud trends that we see in the industry today. Joining me today is Prakash Santhana, Director from Deloitte Financial Advisory Services, LLP. Welcome, Prakash.
Thank you very
So
much.
let's begin. Can you tell us about trends you are seeing in the industry to both detect and prevent fraud?
Cindy, thank you very much for having me on the show. So if you look at the last 10 years, we've seen increasing levels of sophistication in terms of the fraud schemes and an explosion in the number of cyber criminal groups that are targeting organizations and to commit fraud. They're not just focused on monetary gain. Previously it was that the fraudsters would hack into somebody's bank account and siphon money. Nowadays we're seeing a larger trend, and the trend is they're targeting organizations pretty much in every sector to look for intellectual property, customer lists, prototype design, blueprints, etc. Anything of value. So the goal there being that it's not just monetary benefit, but it's also other types of economic benefit.
Let me ask, what do they do with the customer list, for example?
So if they want to create a competing organization, let's say in their state, and they want to target the same customers with, let's say, cheaper products. So they are able to, their goal is to get anything of economic value that could benefit them.
Talk about the impact fraud can have on an organization.
Sure. There are basically three types of risks if you look at any organization. First, there's the reputational risk. That is a single serious fraud event that could get the name of the organization on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. The second one is regulatory risk, adhering to regulations within a country, within a region, or even part of a network. And then the third one is transactional risk. Transactional risk is often the cost of doing business. When you look at any organization, in fact most organizations, they focus on regulatory and transactional risk. And when they say transactional risk, it's based on past fraud events. They are unable, unfortunately, any organizations have a business case or try to come up with a business case based on past fraud events. If you do that, it's very unlikely you'll be able to protect against reputational risks. The way to do that is to examine the vulnerabilities within your entire organization. We recently did a survey of 2,400 executives from various organizations. We found only 8% of them have an enterprise fraud unit within their organization. 28% of them said that their fraud resides within the IT organization. If you look at any IT organization, it is burdened with a lot of different issues, and they probably will not be able to monitor, detect, and prevent fraud across the enterprise. To do that, you need to have an enterprise fraud unit that is capable of detecting and preventing both internal and external fraud. And across four dimensions, you have to have the right type of people who are trained in detecting fraud, the right type of processes, the right technology to be able to detect and alert, and then the right controls in place. And also having the right escalation procedures. When you see fraud, if it is normal fraud versus serious fraud, what are the different escalation procedures that the organization needs to have? How high up will they have to escalate a particular serious fraud event? And do they have liaisons with law enforcement so that they could pull in law enforcement in the event it is a very serious fraud event?
So you talked about technology and many companies focusing on technology managing fraud, which is very transactional heavy, if you will. If I have an EFM team, are they more proactive? Are they more forward thinking in terms of fraud prevention?
Very good question. So the enterprise fraud unit, the purpose of creating that unit is not to monitor past fraud activities by creating rule sets to prevent only past fraud activities. Their goal is to evaluate the entire organization constantly and identify potential vulnerabilities that may exist. An example could be, let's say a new software system is being deployed so that consumers can come in and make a payment or look up their online balance and so on. So if some vulnerability is being introduced as a result of the new software that's not being tested, that enterprise fraud unit should have processes and procedures and people within their unit to be able to evaluate that particular software or technology being deployed prior to it being accessed by end consumers. So it's not simply basing it on past fraud events. It's constantly evaluating what's going on within the organization and even internal employee fraud. Then the next thing that an organization has to invest in is advanced analytics, using account data, login data, and session data to be able to analyze the behavior of that particular user and see if they detect any anomalies so that they can then start to escalate and do subsequent investigation to see if it is indeed a fraudulent transaction or a legitimate transaction.
And when you say account data and login data to the bank platforms or login data within their own platforms?
Both. So if it is an organization that's logging in, that's allowing consumers to do all kinds of transactions, it could be a bank transaction, but it could be other transactions, dealing with their vendors, dealing with their suppliers, dealing with their customers. So if people are authorized to do certain transactions, they may have certain privileges to do a particular transaction or authorize a particular amount for a given transaction. Anytime these transactions happen, when analytically you can identify any potential anomalies in the transaction, it's always better to alert those transactions, have somebody investigate them. It could be as simple as a manager of a particular unit within an organization going in and doing an ACH transaction to pay off a vendor or a supplier. Or it could be somebody within an organization having enough access privileges to, let's say, access sensitive data within the organization. So the key thing is to monitor all activities within the organization and be able to identify any potential anomalies.
So a company needs to monitor their own systems, financial systems, with the same rigor that they manage their banking platforms, if you will.
Absolutely, absolutely true. Because if they don't monitor their own internal systems, so the point of origination is important.
Yeah.
So the point of origination could be as simple as an employee's laptop. So the employee could have, many organizations follow bring your own device programs. So as they take these devices home and do whatever transactions, they could introduce malware onto their laptops, which in turn could introduce malware into the organization. So just because a bank account was compromised doesn't mean it was the bank. It could be within an organization because of lack of policies, procedures, and proper detection techniques within an organization.
Well, and the one thing you talked about is that HR data.
Yes.
And having tight integration of that HR data into the financial systems, I think, is critical, because as employees leave the organization, you want to make sure they no longer have access and they have approval limits, et cetera.
Absolutely. So HR data is very key, and oftentimes banks are, organizations themselves are prohibited from looking at HR data.
Yeah.
So as an example, most organizations have a mandatory vacation policy, and the idea behind that is to ensure that somebody's checking into their system. It's a random check during that time when the employee is out to ensure that they haven't done anything abnormal. What happens if the employee says they are going on vacation, but they're logging in remotely? Who monitors that? So the IT systems only look at remote login, but they don't correlate it with the vacation policy. So it's extremely important you get it all together to ensure that that the fraud framework uses all this information to identify, detect anomalous behavior.
So what's happening with technology spend since the economy still shows some uncertainty?
Good point. So in the same survey that we did, we asked the question. We said, is fraud a high priority? We found that 47% of our responders said, yes, it is a high priority. But ironically, only 8% indicated that they had an increased budget over the last year. 21% said no budget increase at all.
But let me ask the question, is that because they're dependent on their banking partners to protect them?
Yes, so they are focused more on the fraud in terms of their monetary loss and not in terms of other loss, such as theft of IP and so on within their organization. Yeah. We need to be careful about not basing it on past fraud events, but identifying potential vulnerabilities to prevent reputational fraud risks. Fraudsters don't have a business case. Organizations have to have a business case. So it's important that they are able to identify the vulnerabilities, quantify the amount of investment that they need to plug the hole or the vulnerability, and then create a business case to better their fraud framework. So companies are also relying on their banks to provide tools and educate them on their latest fraud trends, how they can help, what should they do in the event there is fraud. So Cindy, you manage the channel strategy for a top global bank. What trends are you seeing within the world of fraud in your organization?
So certainly we have experienced our clients having an increase in malware occurrences. That is certainly a trend. On the card side, face-to-face card fraud continues to increase as a result of magnetic strip compromise, specifically in the U.S. Countries that have implemented EMV or chip have witnessed a significant decrease in counterfeit fraud. Lost, stolen fraud has also decreased in countries where a PIN is required to do a transaction, and we're seeing that within our card portfolios. Fraud in the countries that have implemented EMV or chip have migrated to online or non-face-to-face fraud. And phishing is also the primary source that we're seeing for online account takeover. Right. On a more positive note, we are seeing corporates, we are seeing our clients really focusing more on reconciliation. So tight monitoring of unauthorized transactions, making sure they have the appropriate debit authorizations, particularly for consumer payments. In Europe, mandate management has certainly significantly helped manage payment fraud. More controls on authorized payments to vendors, meaning within the ERP platform, having dual approvals, making sure that all those controls are in place to authorize new payees, and intraday reconciliation, both of online payments, high-value payments, reconciling the files that are being sent to the bank, reconciling the payment values of those files. Those are best practices, and we certainly are seeing that as a way to prevent fraud. Given the trends I've outlined and you've talked about, what steps can organizations take to prevent fraud?
Sure. So when we talk about, you already mentioned face-to-face transactions. So the biggest problem there is the compromise on the stripe. And as you said, if you look at countries that have implemented chip and PIN, so let's take the UK for example, starting in 2006 when they implemented chip and PIN, their counterfeit fraud and their lost stolen fraud started to plummet. But there are countries that have implemented chip and signature, where you can use the chip card, but you sign like you do here. Their counterfeit fraud has plummeted, but not lost stolen fraud, because I could still steal your card and then do a transaction. In the US, we have each network is trying to adopt one strategy. So one network is going the way of chip and PIN, the other one's going the way of chip and signature. We still have to see how it plays out.
Thank you, Prakash, for joining us today. Bank of America Merrill Lynch continually looks for opportunities to provide ongoing education and resources for our client regarding fraud prevention. Please contact your Treasury Sales Officer for additional information. We will continue to provide useful, real-time education about fraud prevention from our subject matter experts and industry leaders throughout the year.